Thank you to the organizers of the Webb lecture for inviting me to give this talk and for also accommodating me since I'm not able to travel. Let me briefly introduce myself and my talk. My name is Aparna Nair. I'm a historian of disability and race and public health at the University of Toronto Scarborough's Department of Health and Society. And today I will be talking to you about health and disability seals and stamps in 20th century US history. Um, the I'd like to begin my talk by evoking one of the most significant figures in disability rights in the US and advocacy in the US, Judith Heumann, a central figure in the emergence of the disability rights movement and in the ADA's emergence as well. In 1980, Heumann was testifying in front of the US Commission on Civil Rights, and her testimony was engaged with ideas about prevailing ideas about disability, normalcy, and the role of physicians, especially. She was talking specifically about how physicians and people outside of medicine tended to view wheelchair users. And I'd like to read from that bit of the quote here. Um, One very interesting scenario that runs through my story and throughout the story of many disabled individuals is the fact that there is a desire on the part, and I don't want to just label the medical profession at this point, um, that one becomes more normal, whatever that means, when one is walking. If one is not walking, one is not normal. And here she evokes the subject of this particular talk, and that is stamps. I think you only need to look at the 1970 stamp that was put out by the US government titled Hope for the Crippled. The stamp, which you're seeing on the slide here, was a stamp of a person seated in a wheelchair rising to a standing position. That, to me, indicates what people thought of disabled individuals in a wheelchair, which is a more visible thing, which is why I am sure they selected a wheelchair. You are not considered a whole person. However, once you are in the standing person, that is normality. Now, for Human, this stamp was an embodiment of ableist ideas about disability that prevail in wider society and was communicated and aggravated by physicians in general. She was challenging this medicalized idea of disability, but also the idea that wheelchair users could not live full lives unless and until they were cured or fixed in some way. In essence, she was challenging the medical model of disability here. What I'm really fascinated by is how she picks up on the stamp in particular. Now, implicit in her statement is an acknowledgement of the power of stamps more broadly as media to carry narratives about disability. And this entire paper is actually predicated both on Humans, narrative of the stamp, but also on scholarship by disability studies scholars and historians, namely the paper that I've listed here, noted here, Swan, Mead, Klein, and Serlin's paper on the politics of postage stamps, which urges historians to take stamps of all sorts most seriously as a medium for disability history and for disability activism in general. What kinds of narratives about disability do stamps generally carry, and how can we explore changes in these narratives through time? So drawing on Humans' interest in the 1969 stamp, actually, and the other work that I've cited here, this particular paper will first present to you a wider history of stamps and describe some, definitional, define some terms for you in case you're not familiar with what they mean. And then I'm going to describe four different categories of disability and health seals and stamps, and explore them as visual culture in the broader histories of disability, public health, and medicine. I argue essentially in this paper that in the same way that we take public health posters and other kinds of ephemera in public health and medicine as, visual narratives about illness and disability and healing and biomedicine, we should also take stamps seriously in the same way. I also present stamps as ephemera left behind by large disability philanthropy programs over the centuries, really, and also track stamps as material culture. One of the things I want us to think about is how many millions of these little pieces of paper actually circulated in the 20th century, and why it matters for us that so many of them traveled into homes, essentially. But I also want us to think about stamps and seals as disability things, as Catherine Ott put it. These are the things that are used and created by disabled people as they live their daily lives. And as this paper will demonstrate, while stamps and seals began as narratives about disability imposed from outside, eventually over the course of the 20th century, disabled people and the organizations that they build actually begin to change some of the narratives that are presented through stamps and seals. So first, brief definitions. Everyone knows what a stamp is, but let me just briefly present to you a small history. Stamps are essentially these small gummed, printed, often colorful pieces of paper, which are affixed to packages and envelopes. There are many categories of stamps, and philatelists actually have a, whole nosology for stamps, but I'm going to briefly describe to you just a few. So the postage stamp is the generic term for the stamp that you probably are most familiar with, which started with, of course, the issuing of the penny black in 1840 in the UK, which transformed the mail system in the UK and rapidly spread across the world. This particular postage stamp existed and was issued with the intent of being used as documentary evidence of prepaid postage, essentially. And today, they're an internationally recognized medium. Every year to this day, National Postal Services issue commemorative stamps, and there's a element of ceremony now to the narratives that are conveyed through these stamps, and there's a lot of advocacy behind these narratives as well. Now, considering stamps as sources, there's actually a fairly rich body of work that has looked at what stamps mean in various contexts. Donald Reed would argue in 1984, for instance, that there are three ways in which we can consider stamps: as material objects, as evidence of the kind of functioning of the postal services in general, but also as bearers of symbols. So, and as part of a system of communications between various actors. And that's actually one of the things I tried to kind of use in this particular paper. And both historians and and geographers and cultural studies scholars, post-colonial studies scholars have, to name just a few, have used stamps as evidence and as sources, have contextualized them as technologies central to mobility, identity, emblematic of 19th century modernity, as national propaganda, as technologies of empire and colonization, as technologies that facilitated the cultivation of national and racial consciousness, like the white Africana consciousness discussed in the work of Gary Baines, published last year, a stamp of which is featured on the slide as well. So clearly, stamps offer a great deal of opportunities to historians, and there's a lot of work that remains to be done, I think. Historians of medicine also have explored stamps as sources, but they've tended to primarily look at them as kind of documenting medical history and landmarks in medical history, vaccination, the great men of science, so to speak. I'm interested particularly in a subcategory of stamps which are known infelically as Cinderella stamps. And they're called Cinderella stamps because stamp collectors tend to not focus as much on, not be as interested, at least they didn't in the past, weren't as interested in the collection of Cinderella stamps, so they weren't as valuable as other national postage stamps, for instance. A Cinderella stamp is a stamp in all but its national international postal function. So it has no kind of monetary value. If you put it on a package or a letter, it has a maybe decorative or informational or advertising purpose, but it does not have any intrinsic financial value. It does not, convey the same meaning that a postage stamp does. Um, and these are not typically issued by states like postage stamps. Instead, they're issued by companies, community organizations, charities, um, you know, uh, uh, um, and you'll see various examples of this. They look very similar to stamps. So, they are often gummed, they are perforated, although minority might not be. And, for example, you're seeing propaganda stamps issued by a Soviet a publishing company in the 1920s. On the bottom three of these, commemorating Soviet industry. And above that, you're seeing, these kinds of Cinderella stamps issued by the American Bible Society in the mid 20th century. So there's a broad range of stamps that are considered Cinderella stamps, but I'm interested in the ones that tell us something about health and medicine and disability. And certainly in the US, charity stamps have been used to raise funds for healthcare for a very long time, actually. The Smithsonian Institute actually has um, uh, a brief blog that tracks the history of charity stamps in the context of the Civil War. And the author talks about how with the establishment of the Sanitary Commission in 1861 to look after the health and welfare of Union soldiers, which, however, needed funds. And a part of this fundraising effort took the form of sanitary fairs, which in turn issued charity stamps to raise funds. And these are the stamps that you're seeing on the slide here. But in this particular talk, I'll be talking about four categories of charity stamps or seals, as I said. And the first of these is one that you might be very familiar with, the Christmas seal. So the Christmas seal you might have perhaps come across in histories of tuberculosis and perhaps some other histories of medicine context. Its origin, however, dates back to 1904 and to Ejnar Holborg. I'm sure I'm butchering that, a postmaster in Denmark, who came up with the idea of using a decorative stamp without any kind of monetary value, not for postal use, but to raise awareness and funds for tuberculosis. And of course, this is the early 20th century. Tuberculosis is in many ways a global concern. The first issue, he presents his idea to the king and to the post office, and he eventually gets permission to issue the stamp, this particular stamp. and thus is born the first kind of Christmas seal. It was intended to be, fixed onto letters and post packages, right next to the postage stamp itself. And you'd buy it it was sold at the time for about 2 ore, and it raised a substantial amount of money. About 2 decades after it was first issued, the sale of Christmas seals in Denmark would raise about 200,000 krona a year. So it's a really, a fair amount of money that these small, decorative pieces of paper are actually um, producing in terms of fundraising. And not only did these funds go towards tuberculosis, efforts in anti-tuberculosis efforts in Denmark, they eventually also would help build a sanatorium, which was literally named the Christmas Seal Sanatorium. This practice of issuing a decorative, charity stamp for Christmas, which was used to raise funds for tuberculosis efforts, also go towards building sanatoria, would spread across the world. It would go to reach Finland and other Scandinavian countries in a very short period of time. Switzerland by 1912, Czechoslovakia and Japan by 1924. France and Belgium by 1925, Poland and UK the next year, Korea would take a little longer, 1935, and Hungary by 1938. And this is just a representative number, number of countries. It actually becomes kind of a global enterprise, which is a whole another paper as well. It also spreads through the networks of empire. So once it reaches the UK, for instance, it reaches South Africa in 1929, Canada and Bermuda in 1931, India in 1943. Ceylon also, I think in 1943, is perhaps the oldest one that I was able to find. And you're seeing actually an example of the Ceylon Anti-Tuberculosis Association's Christmas seals from 1955, issued in both English, Tamil, and Sinhalese on the right of the slides. The same holds true for the spread of Christmas seals through the French Empire as well. Now, it reaches the US by 1907, 1908, and everyone is familiar with the role of Emily Bissell in facilitating, this particular program and bringing the idea of the Christmas seals to the Red Cross and, receiving permission and funds to get this program started. It was a remarkable success, and you're seeing the first Christmas seal on the slide as well. In one city alone, in Atlanta, 200,000 Christmas seals would sell in as little as 5 days. By the 12th of December, it raised $135, and money would go to local anti-tuberculosis chapters, but was also shared with the local National Red Cross Society. So the first kind of cohort of, for the first few decades, it was actually run and administered by the Red Cross Society. But eventually it would be taken over by the National Tuberculosis Association, which was a predominantly physician led organization, which was interested in tuberculosis control. But in the period from 1908 to 1919, the Red Cross Christmas Seal program would raise about 15 million, would issue around 15 million seals to 400 million seals by 1990. So that's a huge number, really. And once the I just want to also briefly talk about the visual narratives of these Christmas seals. Unsurprisingly, given their name, the symbols and messages on these seals have everything to do with Christmas. There's holly, there's snow, snowy landscapes, and the quite significantly, of course, the Red Cross itself is often centered in these seals. These are the seals from 1907 to 1915. And eventually, of course, Father Christmas begins, Santa Claus begins to make an appearance in these seals as well. By 1920, 1 year after the National Tuberculosis Association took it over, the Christmas seals began to use the Cross of Lorraine. Now, this is a this was a symbol that had Christian meanings. It was a double-barred cross, and over the course of the 20th century, the Cross of Lorraine would actually become synonymous with the so-called war on tuberculosis. And you see, this is actually one of the things that you look for whenever you're looking at a seal. Even if you don't understand the language of the seal, you will be able to recognize it as a Christmas seal if you see the Cross of Lorraine. Interestingly, however, the Christmas seals, although they raise funds for tuberculosis, you do not see any representations of people who are ill or struggling with a disability arising from tuberculosis. Decades into its issuing, well into the 20th century, it continues to center imagery of Christmas rather than anything else. But the practice of issuing Christmas seals was not restricted to the National Tuberculosis Association. There were many local branches and organizations that issued variants of these Christmas seals for their own fundraising efforts. There were also several, sanatoria and hospitals that issued their own versions of Christmas seals, and I've included a select number of these for you to have a look at on the slides. A slide here. There are seals from sanatoria in Texas, Colorado, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Norfolk, Virginia, and all of these share a profoundly, Christian religious messaging. You see the three wise men. You see the Bethesda Sanatorium seal is really interesting to me because it's one of the few that actually shows possibly the silhouette of a sick person. It includes a quote from the Bible, but also you see Christ as the physician, the great healer, being represented in this particular seal. The one exception that I was able to find, of course, was the seal issued by the Trades Unions Anti-Tuberculosis Association organization, and that was definitely not definitely did not have the same kind of Christian ethos. So aside from the Christmas and religious symbolism, what else can we get out of these representations of visual narratives of disability or the lack thereof on the Christmas seals? When we do see human figures in these seals, they're largely white representations of disability. And that's not really surprising given the broader cultural and historical ethos at the time, despite the fact that tuberculosis was a significant public health concern for Black populations, as an example. For example, in Philadelphia in 1900, tuberculosis mortality for Black Philadelphians was between 2.5 to 3 times more than for white Philadelphians. But at the same time, there's also evidence that the practice of getting people to participate in the Christmas Seals program became part of the way that the emergent Black middle class engaged with these national programs. Black physicians certainly and community leaders certainly also encouraged people to participate in the program because it did have consequences um, um, for their communities as well. And I'm just going to briefly also mention that the Christmas seals take off and become so successful that the NAACP actually begins to issue its own version of Christmas seals. Now, these are not actually related to health or disability, but I thought they were worth mentioning nonetheless because they signify how powerful this particular medium had become. Most evidence on this suggests that they had witnessed the kind of uh, uh, the percolation of Christmas seals as a medium and as a fundraising medium, especially, and its success. And it starts off quite early, actually, 1927, with Black activist and a school teacher, Memphis Tennessee Garrison, who designs some of the earliest NAACP Christmas seals, and eventually she hands it over to the national organization in 1931, I think. It becomes a national program, and it raised funds for all manner of um, civil rights issues, including the March on Washington, but also lynching, anti-lynching efforts, advocacy for for Black people, encouraging you know. Encouraging employers to employ more Black people in their companies, etc. Discrimination, and this ran from about 1930s to around 1977 when the NAACP put an end to the program. But I think it's a good signifier of how effective the seal itself is as a medium in general. Now, having discussed Christmas seals, I'd like to talk about Easter seals. Now, Easter seals are, you might have heard this name, referring to the Easter Seals Society, right? So the name itself comes from the seals that they actually use as advocacy. But the Easter Seals Society actually had the organization had its roots in what was then known as the National Society for Crippled Children, established in 1919 through the support of a businessman, Edgar Allan, who had seen his son die in an accident and wanted to support health-related charities. This is one of the oldest kind of voluntary organizations for the disabled in the U.S. And by mid 20th century, it has a kind of huge network of centers, clinics, classes, camps, convalescent homes. And it would have a domino effect on the lives of so many disabled people and children in a profoundly meaningful way. So it remains an extremely influential disability advocacy group, and was also central to advocacy for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Um, and bringing my attention back to the medium that is the subject of this talk, the Easter seals themselves. It's in 1934 that the first Easter seals were actually issued. And this was driven by the success of the Christmas Seals program. And explicitly, because that program was so successful, it would receive endorsements from President Roosevelt, who would say in a letter to the International Society for Crippled Children that this SEAL program would arouse national consciousness on behalf of the crippled child and raise funds for his care and general welfare. Millions of seals issued by the Easter Seals program would circulate in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the program was eventually so successful that the organization would change its name to the Easter Seals. So what of the visual narratives of disability in the seals themselves. This is the very first Easter seal you're seeing on the slide here. It was designed by J.H. Donaghy, who was a artist, and he had based the design around the people who were just served by the charity. And it's a fairly simple design. You see the cross symbolizing you know um, medicine and care, but at the heart of the image is a disabled child using a crutch, and it's a very simple message: help crippled children. It's supposed to evoke, I think, primarily elicit kind of pity and sympathy from the presumably able-bodied viewers. Other examples of these two seals, often, as you're seeing on the slides here, often feature illustrations of children, often reaching up to light. So you have symbols of hope, including sunrises and light, often featured in these designs. And the messaging kind of reinforces the idea of that joy is life. A better life. And you often see prosthetics and assistive devices as well in these representations. Although especially in the 40s and 50s, it's very rare to see any frank visual representation of disability. Whatever, however, disability is often implied through the use of these visual signifiers like crutches and wheelchairs. But you very rarely see any, frank representation of illness or disability, which perhaps is not surprising given that this started off as a children's charity. And by 1952, the Easter seals would adopt the symbol of the lily as kind of their official logo. And you'll see this in all the Easter seals from that moment on. Of course, the lily is a symbol of both spring and of Easter as well. Now, I've looked at both visual narratives in the Easter seals and in the Christmas seals, and now I want to talk about seals used in advocacy for the blind. Once again, because the Christmas seals and the Easter seals program was so successful, it's really unsurprising that a whole host of smaller organizations and charities for disabled people in the U.S. would begin to publish their own seals and to raise funds. Now, this ranged from larger organizations like the Lions to, smaller city-based or state-based organizations for the blind, like the San Francisco Institute for the Blind. The Lions had them, for example, centered activism and advocacy for the blind as early as 1917, and they raised funds for testing, treatment, diagnosis, getting children, corrective eyewear if necessary, and the kinds of seals that they issued. One of the examples is from that you're seeing on the slide here is from 1942, and it's a quite a crude example in terms of its art, but you see a blind man shown in profile, and he's holding on to the harness of a guide dog, and it simply says Lions Club Blind Aid. And the Lions Club is not alone. Like I said, there's a whole host of organizations that issue seals to raise funds for the cause of the needs of the blind. So you see the National Federation for the Blind issue the Honor the White Cane seal in 1949, and there are others. Also like the San Francisco Center for the Blind. And here, it's worth kind of noticing what how these seals use white canes and dark glasses to kind of signal blindness to the viewer. Um, uh, and like I said about the Christmas seals, it's also worth noting that these are predominantly white representations. Representations of white disability narratives. And you also see, in addition to the white cane and the dark glasses, you also see the lighthouse, which is a very common symbol for blind activism and advocacy. Lights in general, light lanterns, lamps, and lighthouses are very common as visual themes and signs in these seals. Um, so now that I've described Christmas seals and how they were issued around Christmas time and became part of the kind of, uh, um, you know, they often were imbricated within the celebration of Christmas itself. Similarly, the Easter seals were anchored to Easter temporarily. And in the US, you also see the emergence of what was known as Thanksgiving seals programs. A whole host of organizations issued these Thanksgiving seals. And what's really interesting is the kind of punctuation of the year by these, by these events. So you have the Christmas seals, the Easter seals. You also had Valentine's seals, which I haven't really engaged with in this paper because it's too much. And then you have Thanksgiving seals, and you will see why Thanksgiving really works rhetorically for the purposes of disability fundraising, but also how interesting that can be. One of the things I want to say with this paper is how these diverse national and local organizations and actors work to kind of split up the year and anchor disability temporally to these particular moments uh, um, and produce these media. So Thanksgiving seals were typically framed in terms of be thankful for or give thanks for your sight. So you're seeing three examples of Thanksgiving issued for blind advocacy and activism by various organizations, the Foundation for the Junior Blind, for instance, and um, uh, and it's quite explicit in its framing. Give thanks for your sight, Thanksgiving. It's quite explicitly clear, which is why the title of this paper is Be Thankful You Can See. One other theme that you see in many of these Thanksgiving seals issued for blindness is the figure of the guide dog. I had actually mentioned the white cane and the dark glasses as technologies of blindness, which become signifiers of blindness as well in these media. And you also see the emergence of guide dogs across many seal campaigns issued by various organizations, especially by the early 1940s. It's not really surprising given the wider historical context. You have a while the First World War certainly gave an impetus to the guide dog program by the 1940s, the early 1940s, the Second World War provided even more of an impetus, and eventually the guide dog program in the US would expand beyond its existing schools and institutions. But it also meant that there was a cultural push to kind of change prevailing ideas about dogs in public spaces and what guide dogs could do for blind people. So seals in this particular case are also serving this role. They are part of this cultural push. You see films, for instance, representations of guide dogs in comics in mid 20th century US culture. and newspaper articles. People are writing memoirs, and I would argue that these seals are an important part of this cultural push to transform public perceptions of guide dogs and what they do for blind people. Um, and I think one of the reasons the guide, it's important to look at this is because it often, these representations of blind people with guide dogs on seals would often featured usually a white blind man holding on to the harness of a guide dog outside, right? And which you're seeing in this particular series of Thanksgiving seals that issued for blind advocates, which every single seal features a guide dog and in particular various contexts. And the messaging is quite explicit. Be thankful you can see. So it's quite clear also that this is a message intended for a predominantly able-bodied audience, a sighted audience. So one of the things I want to make clear is that the Christmas seals, Easter seals, especially in these early years, were narratives of disability created by non-patient or non-disability self-advocate dominated groups, right? So the narratives that you see are first in the Christmas seals of just erasure, really. And in the Easter seals, you see representations of disabled children as kind of intended to evoke pity and sympathy in the viewer, and hopefully make them support the cause. But in the mid 20th century, there are you see from the 1930s onwards, really post First World War onwards, you see the emergence of many disability self-advocate groups. A lot of them run by veterans who change the idea, who are challenging the idea of disability as dependency or disability as tragic or pitiable. And one example of this is the Federation which was initially called the Federation for the Handicapped, and then later the Federation for the Handicapped and Disabled, which was established by First World War veterans. It had an explicit focus on rehabilitating disabled people and returning them to productivity, quote. And you can see this focus on self-advocacy and this ethos of independence and individuality in the seals that this particular organization issued as well. Um, while they are anchored to Thanksgiving through the text giving thanks, but also through the visual. As you can see, the pilgrims on the slide on the seal on the right. They also explicitly, talk frame disability here not as dependence, not as needing, charitable donations, but instead disability as active and engaged and seeking independence, and yeah. Um, oh, right. Okay. Similarly, the DAV, the Disabled American Veterans, also would have a seed campaign. I'm not going to provide too much historical background on the DAV here, since it's a better known organization. But the DAV's Thanksgiving Seal program also began in the 1940s and would start at the 1st of October. It was administered by local DAV branches and was the campaign was initially tailored solely to the needs of disabled and their families for any kind of hospitalization or institutionalization needs, for rehabilitation, welfare, and within VA hospitals within each state, but also would provide for any kind of, to some limited extent, also testing and diagnosis and things like that. But coming to the visual narratives on DAV seals, you also see similarly explicit connections between Thanksgiving and the project of care for disabled veterans. These two are very striking examples. You see the visual representations of Thanksgiving through the pilgrim, but also the turkey. Um, and lettering as well. Let us be thankful, and we are thankful to be Americans. This is one of the most striking examples of the Thanksgiving seals, I think, from the DAV. I think it's 1944, if I'm not mistaken. It's the coloring is worth noticing. It is red, white, and blue. And I think the reason I find this so striking is also the way it's designed is really telling. You have this is a quadruple amputee. He's unsmiling mostly. He's seated on a wheelchair, and he has simple kind of pincer prosthetics on both arms, and his pant legs are kind of neatly pinned and tucked under him. Um, and behind him, there's kind of a halo of white light. There's so many layers to this particular representation that are worth kind of teasing out. It's a message to able-bodied Americans, definitely speaking, that on this Thanksgiving, be thankful, but be thankful for the price that disabled veterans have paid for you, basically, in service of their nation, and implicitly connecting their disabilities to war and their patriotic service for the nation. But there's also the implicit message that it's not enough to be thankful. You also have to support these disabled veterans because of the way that they became disabled. So it's a unique category of disabled people in general. Similar to the DAV and the Federation for the Handicapped, the Disabled Persons Association, which also began as a kind of a social club, really. It began as a way of giving disabled people kind of a space to be to socialize, but eventually would evolve into kind of a non-profit, non-sectarian group with the primary goal of job placement and rehabilitation through employment. You can see kind of the echoes of this, the changing narrative about disability also in the 1940s is quite evident in the SEALs themselves, and that's not surprising given the context of war and the fact Second World War, and you have the issue of what to do with disabled veterans that are coming back. And the DPA was, in newspapers, often described as an organization of, by, and for disabled people. And they would do job placements for disabled people and focus predominantly on veterans during the war, but eventually would expand their programs to civilians as well. And the SEAL sales were a significant part of their fundraising and publicity efforts. And these are two examples of the Thanksgiving seals, the seals issued by the DPA. Now, the DPA, unlike the other organizations I've mentioned already, issued their seals during Independence Day, further reinforcing the connection between, patriotism and the disabilities inscribed on the bodies of disabled veterans, especially. The coloring is very striking. It's red, white, and blue once again. And the 1953 one that you're seeing on the right here is actually fascinating to me because of the logo accent on ability. It's a fairly early kind of reframing of the narrative on disability and recharacterizing what disabled people are capable of instead of focusing on what they lack or how they could be fixed or cured. harkening back to what Human said at the beginning of this talk. Um, Now, I'm going to briefly talk also about seals as public health messaging, and this is one of my kind of niche interests. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the talk, but I think it's worthwhile because this actually is one of the broader purposes of seals also. The DAV, for instance, would issue safety seals, which had various safety messages for about traffic, etc. A whole host of other organizations would issue these issue seals for these purposes. But I'm going to introduce you to a few examples from the broader context of epilepsy in the mid 20th century. So it's, after the Second World War, there's something of a shift in the perceptions and attitudes towards people who had epilepsy, partly once again because you have returning veterans who had experienced traumatic brain injuries and were having seizures as a consequence of their injuries. So there is a push in terms of public health messaging to shift the ideas, prevailing ideas about epilepsy, which had previously been, I suppose, tainted by eugenics. Eugenics and eugenicists had typically framed epilepsy as connected to mental defectiveness, dependency, degeneracy, sexual excesses. Prominent neurologists would also describe epilepsy, perhaps, would still advocate for eugenic measures even after the war. But organizations like the Epilepsy Association of national organizations for epilepsy would also begin to work to change public perceptions of epilepsy through seals like this. So this was issued by the Epilepsy Foundation, for instance. I always get the two confused, the British Association and the American Foundation. So this was issued in the 50s, and it's quite clear. So they would come in, all of the seals that I talked about actually would come in this kind of bigger page, and you could tear it apart along the lines and use it as required. So you'd pay for this big page essentially. And this particular page was issued in the 50s, and it was urging employers to employ epileptics, as you can see on the top half, but also if you look at the bottom, there's the labels that are titled "Fragile, Handled with Care, Open Schools for Epileptics." So in the 50s, there was also, of course, the issue of the question of what to do with children who had epilepsy. Did they belong in mainstream schooling or not, right? There were still concerns about whether children with epilepsy could be effectively educated in mainstream schooling. But this is clearly public health messaging that is trying to shift the narrative around epilepsy. So I just want to present some brief context for these wider histories. In the 20th century, I think disability histories that have come out, especially in the past 2 decades, have been fascinating because they reinforce the fact that disability was a significant focus of attention in the US. And there are many reasons for this. The prevalence of tuberculosis, the high prevalence of various kinds of occupational disabilities in various populations, and how those tended to the needs of disabled workers became a source of anxiety and concern for policymakers, but also world wars in the first half of the 20th century. It resulted in a significant number of disabled veterans. Then you have, successive epidemics of polio, resulting in significant numbers of disabled children as well. So the question of disability is quite urgent in the period that I'm talking about here, which is about 1904 to end of the 1950s really. And it provoked a range of legislative and policy responses, but it also provoked a range of advocacy and activism responses from both disability self-advocates and non-disabled individuals and groups as well. Scholars like Beth Linker and John Kinder have also proven how central disability becomes to defining citizenship and belonging in the US in the 20th century, but also tracked, many scholars have also tracked how disability philanthropy in this particular period becomes modeled after businesses, and how that begins to shape, for instance, how telethons worked. The work of Paul Longmore comes to mind here. It's also worth contextualizing these SEAL campaigns as social and structural responses to the shortfalls in state and federal funding for disabled Americans of all ages. And, I thought it would be worthwhile noting that when the Easter SEALs was launched in Texas, local newspaper, the Austin American, noted that there were 20,000 disabled children in the state of Texas, and the state legislature had only allotted $10,000 for the biennium starting in September 1933, providing only 50 cents for the care of each child. So here, the funds raised by Easter Seals campaign had the chance to actually make meaningful inroads into the care for disabled children, but it also highlights the holes and flaws in existing state infrastructures and provisions for disabled children. Um, uh, but it's also worth kind of contextualizing SEAL campaigns as proposed by organizations, disability self-advocate groups like the American Federation for the Handicapped, which was conceptualized as part of their broader goal to reshape public perceptions of disability, but also to ensure that millions of disabled men and women and children in the US could participate and share in community activities as well as be self-supporting. So these are, you can see also the very different ways in which these different organizations use the same medium, but conceptualize disability. And these differences are very tangible in the visual narratives of disability as well. I hope I demonstrated that. I want to end by saying that as small and ephemeral as these objects were, they are significant in disability history in the 20th century and were as important to disability advocacy, philanthropy, as the telethon itself, which has received extensive research attention in general. Diverse actors use this particular medium to raise awareness and funds for a range of initiatives for the disabled and chronically ill. And what's also really important for us to think about is the materiality of SEALs, right? So, typically, these programs you'd write in to receive SEALs. You'd pay to receive SEALs, and then you'd take them home, and then you would put them on letters or packages that you were mailing, and they would go out into other people's homes. So these were extraordinary mobile media, right? And in that very mobility, I think it's important for us to consider how brief messages about disability that they carried would also percolate into people's homes. And this is since the SEALs were around before television became ubiquitous, it's worth thinking about the messages that they carry and how effective they were in disability advocacy and philanthropy, and who is left out of these narratives. Like I said, seems to predominantly focus on white disabled people. So given the sheer scale and number of these texts and objects in circulation, I think it's definitely worth considering health and disability SEALs more seriously in general in our fields. Right. Thank you for your time. Let me stop here.